Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about René Descartes and rationalism. And to pick off where we left off at, we were talking about paradigm shifts. And this is the beginning of the first part of the paradigm shift into science standing on its own and being able to jurisdict the future of physical actions in the physical world. One thing to think about Descartes, when you think about, if you go pre-Descartes, you're in the age of scholasticism. And if you're Catholic and you've been to CCD, you've heard of St. Thomas. That would be Thomas Aquinas. He was one of the main philosophers of scholasticism. School being the Latin derivative that's actually we're in school now, so that's where that word originates. But the scholastic philosophers, that would be St. Anselm, Thomas Aquinas, a couple others. They spent a lot of time proving rationally the theistic position. In one of those, and in the book, we'll spend a day and I'll put you in groups and you can each look at one of those proofs and we'll talk about it to the class. But those, basically, there's different things, like there's movement in the world and there had to be a first mover. That's your proof from first movement. There's the unmoved mover, so to speak. So if all movement happens, there has to be someone to make a first move. If there's levels of perfection, some people will call that Neoplatonic, but everything's a little bit perfect, and in Plato's metaphysical epistemological divided line theory, you're going to reach a point where things become more perfect, from less perfect to more perfect, and the most perfect perfection would be God. So that's the argument from perfection. There's also the argument, it's kind of made a comeback here in the last 10 years, the argument from design, the argument from from detailed design. And that's the argument that you can't have, that the world didn't happen by accident, that there's too many things that work in conjunction with the temperature and the ecosystems and the way the world and the universe works together, that it couldn't have happened by accident. And all of these, as you go back into chapter 3, when you look at those, circular reasoning, that they all have elements of that. And I'm just saying that they do, and you need to be aware of that. So, but those middle-aged philosophers, and then there was the argument, the ontological proof. The ontological proof I've always thought is a pretty good proof. That was St. Anselm, I think, came up with that. The idea that just to think of a deity in itself. If you go back to the paper cutter, when we looked at John Paul Sartre, the existentialist, and the paper cutter, and that paper cutter was created to cut paper, so it had a purpose. But if you were living before the Phoenicians, before paper existed, and someone handed you a paper cutter, you wouldn't know what it is. And you wouldn't have been able to think about it. You wouldn't even been able to perceive what it was before it existed, because there would have been no reason to perceive it, because your mind couldn't have perceived something that isn't. And the ontological proof is just the fact that we could perceive a God proves that he exists. So those are all middle-aged philosophies, and those are still very common philosophies, extremely common. And the thing is about those, that I want you to think before we look at Descartes, with all of those philosophies, basically what they were doing is they were taking Scripture and they started with an a priori position, God exists. And then let's take that a priori position and then prove that from there out. So in other words, let's take what we believe first and then add to it. And all of those proofs did that. Descartes came along and looked at things a little different. He was a theist. He was very, very connected to the church and very theistic. But he looked at things as, let's doubt everything first. Let's doubt everything first and then see what's left over. And that was a radically different way of looking at epistemology, which is important. And that's the idea where Descartes came up with the idea of intuition. So you can look at the chart here, 7 plus 4 equals 11. I drew a line, that's a line. But how do we know but 7 plus 4 is 11? And that's a line and not a set of keys, because it's self-evident and given to us as the light of nature, as Descartes would say. And he would call that intuition. And he would say that we have intuition for certain things that are the light of nature, or absolute truths. and we don't know what these truths are, so we have to find them, and we find them through what he called radical doubt. So, what you first have to do is to doubt everything first, then letting that bring into acceptance what is real. The old way was to accept things first, like the scholastic philosophers, and then build your philosophy around it. And that was true. Maybe that's true for the existence of God. Definitely was not true for the flat world and the geocentric universe, because we know the world's round, and we know that the Earth is not the center of the universe. So it's not even the center of the solar system. So the thing is that not everything that Aristotle that had the geocentric world, not everything he said was right. And if Plato would have been alive today, he would have been probably advocating a dictatorship, which, I don't know, that doesn't seem to be too popular. But anyway, so everybody makes mistakes. And Descartes knew this, and Descartes said that what we have to do is find deductive truths. When you take things you know from intuition and apply them to other situations, then you have undisputable truth. And then the cogito ergo sum is that I can't actually know really anything. I don't know for sure if you exist. I know if the physical world I seem to be a part of, it seems to be real. Everything seems to be real. The only thing I can really know, though, for sure is that I exist. And since I think, that makes me not unreal. So I am. Therefore I think. Therefore I am. So that's your I think, therefore I am statement, and how he came to that through radical doubt. And both the rationalist camp, Descartes, and the empiricist camp, which would be Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, but both of them believed that when it gets right down to what we really can know, it's not very much. It's just that Descartes looked at it from an a priori base. And in some ways you could say that what Descartes said and what the scholastic philosophers, Anselm and Thomas Aquinas, said weren't all that much different, because Descartes, through deduction, deducted that there's a God and that there's certain truths, and you base your future truths from the certain truths that you know. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas never believed that that was necessary. It was just a priori. We know that God exists, so how can we show that? Well, we know because after the fact, we know because of the order of the universe. We know because there has to be a first mover. We know because there has to be first motion. We know because the idea of God couldn't be put in us unless there was a God to believe in, so therefore he must be. So there's some 4 or 5 different truths like that, or 4 or 5 different proofs like that. But they basically assume the beginning before you go to the end. Where Descartes said you can't assume the end; you have to start by doubting everything. So that would be where the whole idea of questioning. And then Descartes would say that you really don't know very much. You really can't be sure very much at all. So I'm going to just show you. Here's a card. It's a two of hearts, I guess. And I'm going to take a sheet of paper here, and I'm going to draw a line right along this card. So I'm just going to do that. You're not going to see me do this, but I'm going to draw 2 lines. Well, that wasn't very good. Let me do it again. Just a second. Crap. 1 line. Okay. There you go. Okay, those 2 lines look pretty much the same. And I actually took the top of the 2 of clubs and drew the line from the top of it. So now I'm going to take, and it depends there, if you get it up close you'll see it's more, they're about the same. Now I'm going to take these lines and I'm going to put an arrow going inward on one and an arrow going outward on the other, and I'm going to show it to you. You'll see what I mean. So there's the same line, and of course just about all of us would look at that and say the bottom line is longer than the top line. but if you measure it, it's exactly the same. It's the same line that before I drew them. So really what's happening there is our mind deceives us. And Descartes would say that our minds deceive us, that what we say, what we think we see, we might not be seeing, and what we think is real might not be. And so you can't believe your perceptions. You can't believe your senses, that your senses lie to us. And we can't go by that. That all we can really go by is what we know is an absolute truth from the light of nature. And the only way we can do that is by radical doubt and radical questioning. So that would be kind of the camp that Descartes comes from. Your book has several other examples, and I've got some other examples of some ways where, it's kind of amazing. And this, to me, I'm sitting there thinking, man, is that the same line? I mean, but it is. If you take your card here and you measure it, it's the same. I made them. They're like the same line. But anyway, so that would be kind of an overview, kind of a very quick overview of how Descartes saw the rational world. That you have to first doubt everything, and then letting that bring into acceptance what actually is a priori. And what these things he believed were given to us by God, and they were innate there prior to experience, prior to perception. The perception and experience have nothing to do with it, and all it has to do with reality is what God gave us. So that would be his position on rationalism. And once you can find out what those things are, then you can move forward from there. So I think in ethics, when we get, if I actually have this second section of ethics, we'll look at the 6th grade ideas probably, and in that some of those ideas are truth, goodness, aesthetics, justice, equality, some of those things, and those are along the lines of what Descartes would come to as the things that exist prior to experience. So that's the one position. So now I'm going to stop and start again on the next position, on the opposite of Descartes. But remember, for Descartes to be able to come to this, he had to have acceptance from the church. And the church they actually hired him. He actually was paid. He was a pretty wealthy philosopher, and he was allowed to express these philosophies. He was allowed to do. This was the beginning of where it was starting to become acceptable to philosophically question the prior system. And that's extremely important in understanding how philosophy played a role in modern science.